I don't really want this recorded though, but that's all right. So I'll tell a story. This morning, when I was supposed to do this during the week, and I didn't do it. And I put it off, and I kept thinking, oh, I'll have time to do this tomorrow. I'll have time to do this tomorrow. And I had all kinds of time. I just didn't do it. And that was do my slides for this morning. So this is the story you're not supposed to tell, except for sometimes I tell too much truth. So I got up this morning to make the slides for this, and I didn't have a message. I wrote the message. Something's really hot up here, so I don't know if I'm too loud. I don't know if I think it may be the monitor. So yeah. So thank you if you can figure that out. So long story short, I wrote the message because I gave Beth I gave her the outline and everything, and so she had the outline. But when I opened it up this morning, all it was there was like the date and the title and a couple of words, and that was all I had. So I had the outline. So teaching the lesson is not hard from that standpoint of it. I mean, I can teach from that, and that's probably better when I do. It just was shocking this morning. It was kind of a shock to my system, and I'm like, oh no. So if you don't like it, if it's not historical accurate, and if it's not biblically sound today, I have an excuse. Just kidding. So Kim told the story about me and my road rage, I guess. But the other day, several years ago, Beth was driving near our home when we lived in Indianapolis, and she accidentally pulled out in front of somebody and made them very, very, very angry. And so they were coming around, passing her, getting ready to tell her she was number one, give her the finger. I mean the number one sign, say you're number one. And Beth looked at him with this, I'm so sorry, such an apologetic look that he went, oh, it's okay. Instead of what he wanted to do, I think intentionally what he was intending, he was like, oh no, it's okay. And so, interesting, the Proverbs 15:1. I don't know if anybody knows what that is off the top of your head, but you probably will know it because I know you've heard it, whether you know it's from the Bible or not. A gentle answer turns away wrath. Right? There's more to it, and we'll talk more about that. But that's what I want to talk about today. The title is De-escalating Disastrous Decisions. Has anybody ever made a disastrous decision? Have you ever done that? You've made a decision and it's like, oh, that was so dumb. Why did I do that? Has anybody ever had that happen? There's everybody in here never made a bad decision. Never made bad decisions, never, what on earth was I thinking? But anyway, for a lot of people that happens. Sometimes it is really disastrous. Sometimes it's not so bad. I know one time I loaned someone money, and I go by the biblical principle, don't loan people money if you don't need to get it back. And when I actually never got any of it back, I have to keep reminding myself, I didn't loan the money because I needed it back. And there have been times when it's been really nice to have had it back. And there was times that it would have been nice to be able to look at that person and not think bad thoughts about them because they never paid it back. But there's a lot of truth to that. But how do you de-escalate bad decisions from becoming really disastrous? And what we're really talking about is bad decisions in relationships. Bad decisions on choices of what we say, not necessarily just whether I'm going to go to Kroger instead of Meijer. It's not those kind of decisions, although those can be disastrous too, but those aren't the kind of decisions I'm talking about. Turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 25. 1 Samuel chapter 25, and we're going to look at the whole chapter. You won't be able to see any of the words on the screen today because I'm not even sure which ones I'm going to share this morning. So we're just going to walk through chapter 25, and we're going to teach. First of all, we're going to tell the story of what happened. Okay, let me start at the very beginning. Chapter 25, verse 2, it says, "A certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. And she was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. He was a Calebite." Now, I don't know if Calebite was meaning, you'll understand what I'm talking about, because he was a Calebite. I'm not sure if that's what that was or not, because we know that Caleb was very blunt, and he spoke truth. I mean, we talked about Caleb a few weeks ago, and so I'm not really sure what that meant, but this guy Nabal, he was surly and mean in his dealings. So here's what happened. While he and his flocks were out in the farther reaching pastures, getting fat and making lots of other little baby sheep and goats, right? David was hiding out in the hills with his mighty men and running from King Saul, right? And so David protected Nabal's flocks and his herdsmen from the bad guys, right, who lived in the land. And so he provided them protection, and so they never lost sheep, they never lost anything during their time out there, which is one of the things that they did. It would happen a lot. There would be thieves and robbers, and they would come and they would steal off sheep and goats. And then they would also hurt the herdsmen if they had the opportunity. And while they were out there under David's protection, none of that happened to them. None of that happened. And so it was shearing time, and they're all gathered in Carmel now. And so they're having a party, having a festival, so to speak. And so David sends a group of his guys, and he says, "Hey, go to Nabal and remind him that he enjoyed a time of favor as under our protection. And now that it's time to party, see if he has anything that he can spare to give us so that we can have something to eat." So David says, now here's what happened. So David's men arrived. This is verse 9. They arrived and they gave Nabal the message in David's name, and then they waited. Verse 10 says, Nabal answered David's servant, "Who's this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?" David's men turned around and went back. And when they arrived, they reported every word. And David said to his men, "Each of you strap on your sword." So they did, and David strapped on his as well. And about 400 men went up with David, and 200 stayed back with supplies. So David was mad, right? He was like, "Who is this Nabal to talk to me this way?" Now, I can't say that I think David was handling things correctly there. Maybe there was a little lady in Florida that maybe he could learn from. I don't know, but David, I'm not saying David was all doing right, but what happened is one of Nabal's servants ran to his wife Abigail and tells the story of what happened, and she was like, "Oh no, you're going to have to do it." And so the servant makes sure that he tells Abigail that they never mistreated us. They treated us well. They took care of us the whole time we was out in the field, and nothing was missing. And they were like a wall around us night and day as we did that. So Abigail, verse 18 says, Abigail acted quickly. Abigail acted quickly. So what she did is she gathered a bunch of food, I think like 200 loaves of bread, and just a whole list of things that she gathered. Raisins and cakes and figs and uh, like 5 dressed sheep. I thought about that. I wondered what she dressed them in. I mean, I'm sorry. Just the thought of that just made me think, I wonder if they were in tutus or she had them in some kind of a suit. I bet it was a wool suit, right? Bad joke. So, but actually they had been, right, they'd been slaughtered and dressed out. And so then she told her servants, go ahead and I'll follow you. So just at this time, she's riding her donkey with all of this stuff up into the mountains. David is coming down with his men. And right before David comes around this bend, David says something like this. He says that, may God deal with me ever so severely, something like that, if all of the men who belong to Nabal aren't dead before sunset. He kind of makes this vow that he's going to kill all of them, that all the men are going to be dead. And so right as he says that, comes out of his mouth, as soon as he comes out of his mouth, he sees Abigail. She comes riding up to see him. And she got off her donkey quickly. This is verse 23. When Abigail saw David, she got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, pardon your servant, my lord. Let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Please pay no attention, my lord, to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. And as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my lord sent. So basically what she says is, don't pay any mind to Nabal. Just forget about him. I didn't see your servants. I didn't hear about this, but as soon as I did, I have come to bring you these gifts. And she goes on and talks about how important it is for David not to take vengeance on Nabal and shed Nabal's blood, but with his own hands. And so she lays all this before that, and David wisely cools off, right? He cools off. He's not mad anymore, and he begins to think through what he's doing, and he says to Abigail, thanks. I really appreciate the fact that you saved me from doing this bad thing. You kept me from shedding all this blood. So that's basically what's happening. And so he says, David says in verse 32, praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you to me today, and may you be blessed for your good judgment and from keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. And so all of that goes back. So David accepts the gifts from Abigail, sends her home, he goes back, and verse 36, when Abigail went to Nabal, so when she gets home, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until daybreak. So she waited until the next morning when he had a hangover, but sober, right before she told him anything. So it says, verse 37, in the morning when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things. Now listen to this. And his heart failed him, and he became like stone. And about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. So when David hears that Nabal's dead, he sends a group of servants back to Abigail and invites her to become queen. Asks her to marry him, basically. She says yes, and as soon as she can, she gets her donkey ready and her maidservants, and she quickly goes with David's messengers and becomes his wife. So that's the story. I encourage you to go back and read 1 Samuel 25, and that's the whole story. And you'll get there's a lot to this story, but here's a couple things I want to make sure we point out. First of all, the bad news. I think it's always important to know the bad news. There are mean people in our lives. Right? Have you met them? Do you know some mean people in your life? right? There are just some mean people in our lives. You know, we can talk about how broken people are, how they are the product of their environment, how they're influenced by their own sinful natures, right? But the bottom line is, when people are hurt, when people have the opportunity to really pursue their own nature, their own sinful nature. And in Abel's case, we don't know what had happened to him, but what we do know is that in his wealth, he became very arrogant, and in his arrogance, he gave himself permission to be as mean as he wanted to be. Even thought that he could be rude and cruel to David and his men. David was the Lord's anointed already. David was the Lord's anointed already. And I don't have time to really get into that. But step back for a moment. And when you deal with mean people, there's several things that I think are important. The first one is this. When you're dealing with mean people, always know, and this is the hardest part for me, is that their motives can be very evil and mean. And it's hard for me to accept that sometimes about people. But they really can be, and so you need to be careful. You need to be careful, because sometimes people are so engrossed in their sinful nature that they can be mean. Several of you knew that I was interviewed on the radio a few weeks ago, and as we were talking, the guy interviewing me, said something. I was talking about, sometimes they're just mean. We were talking about people who've been hurt by the church, and we were talking about that sometimes they're just mean people. And there was a story. I'll tell you the story. Many years ago, it was a previous church that I served in. I met this guy at the hospital. His granddaughter was having surgery, and so I'd never met him before, but I knew his kids and his granddaughter, and so we got to talking, and when his daughter, who's the mother of the baby that we were seeing in the hospital, when she was born, he and his wife took their newborn and visited this church. It happened to be the church that I was serving at the time, but it was way years before that. And the baby cried. I mean, she was little, just weeks old, and the baby cried. And this elderly lady taps him on the shoulder and says, "There's a nursery. If you're not willing to put your baby in the nursery, maybe you shouldn't come back." And they didn't ever go back to any church ever again. And people can just be mean. People can just be mean. And sometimes they're mean and they're clueless. Other times they intentionally mean to hurt people. That lady probably was mean and clueless. But other people can be mean and just mean to be mean. And I think that's one of the things that probably has shaped me in being who I think God has called me to be, and the things that God wants us to be is stories like that. Because the unsaid thing is those stories, there are lots of them. And you may have one of those stories. We have them in our own family, about mean things people in church have said. I had a son, well, I still have a son, and a church leader one time told him as a teenager, he was making bad choices. He and I weren't seeing eye to eye. We were struggling, and he told my son that he was embarrassing me and the whole church with his behavior, and that he was a disgrace. And still trying to overcome that one in my own family. Was my son behaving right? No, that's not the question. He was struggling with who he was and choices that he was making. But without a relationship and without the ability to challenge my son in a positive way, the guy just chose just to puke out a bunch of mean things, right? People can be mean. People can just be mean. A couple of things I want to encourage us is within the church, I want to encourage us all that when we meet people in the community and we're talking to them and they have stories like that, two things that have helped me. One is that there are all families have different people in their families, and there's a crazy Uncle Louie in every family, and so we have to understand that even in the family of God, not everyone has God been able to transform as much as that He would like, and certainly not as much as we would like. And there are things about me that God, I'm sure, still desires to transform and change, but hasn't happened yet. So we do need to extend grace. And we also need to understand that not everyone is like that, and not to blame God because there are some mean people who are part of the church. Right? That's not God's fault. We're not going to blame Him and think that we're adults. As a kid, I understand that if a kid meets someone like that, they may transfer that and think, oh, well, God's that way because that person's that way. But as adults, we should be able to grab hold of it. It may be hard to do in our hearts, but if we start with our mind, we can grab a hold of just because someone who claims to follow God behaves this way doesn't mean that's how God is. Right? And sometimes it's hard with our heart, but we got to start with our brain and let that filter down into that 18-inch drop down into our heart and deal with that. Here's the good news. Here's the good news. Proverbs 15:1 says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." In our anger, we sometimes say and do things that we regret later. And I'm not so much talking about Nabal. I mean, I'm sure he regretted it. I mean, as soon as he heard what Abigail did, he had a massive heart attack, and he laid in a coma for a week, and then he died. So I might infer that he regretted his choice in how to treat David. But think about that. Think about it in our own sense. I think Paul's advice in Ephesians about do not let the sun go down in your anger. In your anger, do not sin. I mean, he talks about those things in Ephesians chapter 4. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that for us as we think about this truth. A gentle answer turns away wrath. Okay, so when we're angry, the Scripture never says do not be angry. It talks about do not be angry, or do not sin in your anger. I mean, Jesus, when he was in the temple, I think he was very angry when he took out a whip and he drove out the people who were selling and coin. They were transferring the money, and then they were also selling sacrificial animals. But the real problem was they were cheating the people they were doing the business with. It wasn't like it was just because they were doing that they were cheating. And so, but he took out a whip. He didn't. And if you read the Scriptures, you realize he did that more than once. He did it twice, where he drove them out. And he was very angry, but not to sin in our anger. And so one of the biggest places that we struggle is with what we say. With what we say. Right? I mean, when we're angry, I have a problem when I communicate, because when I get really angry, I can't talk, which on one hand keeps me from saying things that I would regret later, but it doesn't help resolve the issue. Other people have the opposite problem. What are you laughing about? I'm not throwing you under the bus here.
Not Not my name.
Not my name. Other people, when they get angry, it just starts coming out, right? I don't know which one of those you may be. I don't know. But I'm the one that, like I said, when I get angry, I can't talk. I may shake, but I just can't get anything out. And that's not necessarily good. But I don't regret what I said later. I regret what I didn't say sometimes. But if you're one of those people, who struggle with that, how do you tame the tongue in those situations? How do you do that? How do you tame the tongue? If you're thinking that Tracy's about to give you this secret formula, I'm not. But what I will share with you is go check that out in the book of James. Because what you're going to find in the book of James is going to talk about struggling with our sinful nature. What Paul talks about is the idea of taking captive every thought. That's a two-sided coin. The one side of that coin is dealing with the bad thoughts that we have. Taking captive the bad thoughts. But recently, I heard Mark Batterson talk about the other side of that coin. And I thought this was really, really cool idea. And that's not necessarily a negative or trying to control it as much as it is taking the positive thoughts and unleashing them. Because if we struggle with things that we say, what about the things that we don't say that we should say? What about the things that we don't say that we should say? And I'm not just saying the last 10%, because I mean that's been a principle that you may have heard somebody talk about, speaking the last 10%, which means you have to have a relationship with someone strong enough to be able to say the last 10%, right? I mean, go back to my story about my son. The guy didn't have a relationship with my son, and he shared way more than the last 10%. And he certainly didn't say it in a loving, kind way. On the flip side, if you build a relationship, you have a relationship with someone, and you see something in their life, and you don't share the last 10%, the last 10% comes from accountable grace. In a loving way, you have to be able to say, here's something that you probably don't want to hear, but I love you too much not to say it. Right? I mean, that's really getting into the depth of authentic relationships and accountable grace when we do that. So, but taking captive a thought, like taking captive a thought, not just saying, oh, I don't want to think badly of my neighbor, so I'm going to take that captive and I'm going to imprison it and I'm going to put it away somewhere. Okay, maybe you need to do that so that you don't sin. But what if you took captive a thought that you had about your neighbor, about inviting him for supper? Or about finding a way to say something cool about something you saw their child do? Or sharing something with your neighbor that would be encouraging and uplifting. So what if we took those thoughts captive? What would happen if you actually had a dream in your heart about something that God wanted you to do and had built you for and prepared you for? What if you took that thought captive? What could that dream become? See, I think we spend a lot of time on the negative side of that. And I think that Batterson was spot on. Because I don't want to live my life worrying about the things I said that I regret. I want to live my life thinking about the things that could have been and that I captured and I took captive, and I lived for those things that God would desire in my life. I don't know. Here's the bottom line. Today's lesson. Faith acts relying on God's promise. Faith acts. Go back to Abigail. Right? She saw the stupidity of her husband, the folly of her husband, the fool that he was, right? Because that's what his name means. And to protect his life and of all the people in her family, she does something crazy, and she puts herself out there between everyone and David, who was coming with 400 armed warriors, and says, and lays that out there. I mean, that is faith relying on God's promise. She talked about, if you go back to 1 Samuel 25, and you look about what she talks about. She talks about a couple of things. She talks about the fact that David's anointed and God was going to protect him, and she had a lot of truth that she told David in a very intense moment, but she said it with a lot of grace, right? A gentle answer turned away wrath. But she did speak truth to him. She told him things about how he needed to be careful not to be guilty of the bloodshed and not to avenge himself, but to allow God. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. To allow God to have time to do the vengeance thing. Faith acts, trusting God's promise. So let me ask you a question. What choices do you have in your life ahead of you, coming up in this week, by the end of the year? What are some things that you have to decide? And how can you put those things at a faith level and trust God for what he promises, that you're relying on his promises? The application that I have, so let's go to the application. The first one deals with conflict. Go ahead and hit the button on that. Where is conflict most likely to show up in your life? Maybe it's at home. I don't know what season of life you're in, but maybe it's home. Maybe it's between you and your parent. Maybe it's between you and a sibling. Maybe it's between you and a child. So when I say home, I'm talking about family, right? Maybe it's at work. Maybe you have a coworker who just seems that they've made it their goal to make your life miserable. Maybe that's your boss. Maybe it's an employee. Maybe someone that you oversee. Is that what that? Maybe it's social media. I don't know. I know that I've talked about this more than once. How many times have we struggled with social media, where we read a friend's post, and I'll just be honest, the political climate today, I don't care what you think of Republicans, Democrats, or anyone in between, or it's hard to go past them these days. I don't care what you think about them, but it's just the level of disrespect and mean and things that people say, and not just about the policymakers, not just about the politicians, but about anybody who supports that politician. And it's so polarizing. If I choose to not read those, sometimes I make the mistake and read them, and all I do is get all burned up. Even if I agree with the political side that the person is writing the post, it still just irritates me and makes me so mad. So maybe that's where conflict is likely to show up. How can you become an agent? How can you become an agent of peace in that environment, whether it's home, family, work, or even social media? How can you become an agent of peace? What would God have you do? How does a gentle answer turn away wrath? How can we become people in our world who can bring the peace of God into our corner of it? Was it Jesus said, Matthew chapter 5, he said something about, blessed are the peacemakers, right? Blessed are the peacemakers. How do we become peacemakers? How can we use our words to de-escalate situations? The second thing is that very question. Go ahead and go to it, because that's what I just said. How can you use a gentle answer to de-escalate the situation? That's the real thing that what this particular lesson comes down to. There are a lot of other things that we talked about, but that's what this really comes down to. I think what I would like to offer this morning is a prayer. A prayer that is it in the program at the bottom? It's in the program at the bottom. A prayer that we can say now, but a prayer that you can use. I'm not necessarily a great. My heritage isn't liturgy, and my heritage hasn't been someone who reads other people's prayers from my own prayers. My background is I've even struggled with writing prayers out because it's like, how can that be from your heart? But I know that it can be. I've grown in my understanding of all of that. But I think this prayer, I'll confess, I'm not giving credit to anyone because no one else wrote it. This is mine to give you, and feel free to edit it and make it your own and make it better, okay? But here's a prayer. I would like for us to say the prayer together. Can you put it up there? And I can get out of the way. I'd like for us to say it together, if you will, but let's close with that. Let's just say it. Read it out loud with me. Jesus, you are the Prince of Peace. I want you to reign in my life, not conflict. Give me a passion for people. Give me your passion for people. Let me see those who breed chaos in my life through the lens of your cross. Put the gentle answer in my mouth, and give me the wisdom and strength to speak it. Amen. If you have a situation in your life that you would like someone to pray with you about, I know Jill would be more than happy to spend some time praying with you today. If you need to talk to someone about your relationship with Christ, or if you would like to something else going on in your life, you just like to talk with me about, I invite you to come up. So let's stand, and if you need to pray with someone, come up and talk to either Jill or myself, or if you need to talk to someone about your relationship with God or something going on in your life, please come up and talk with me. I'd love to do that. But let's just kind of close with prayer today. Father, the simple truth that a gentle answer turns away wrath. God, how can I trust you in ways that I don't already? To really look to you for those gentle words. God, we seek you to give those words to us at the time. I know in our sinful nature that's really hard. It's hard to take a deep breath and listen and be still and quiet enough to hear what you would say, let alone have the self-discipline to speak the gentle answer instead of what we desire to say. So not only give us the answer, but God, give us strength and wisdom to be able to speak the gentle answer, to de-escalate God, what's going on around us. God, to be peacemakers for your glory and your kingdom. And it's in Jesus' name I pray. And everybody said, amen. All right, with that, dismissed.